4th District here in southwestern Connecticut. Jim Himes, Democrat. Good to have you back with us.
Great to be back.
It's been about 6 months
been
since
a while.
we last saw you. Yeah. And unfortunately, there hasn't been much of a positive change in the economy. Let's begin with that one, because that's what everyone is talking about. What is your prognostication on this?
Well, I think you're right in saying that we're probably more nervous about the economy today than we were 6 months ago. Now, look, the underlying dynamic here is kind of the same it's been for 2-3 years, which is very slow, very unsatisfying recovery. The last month's jobs number, 70,000 private sector jobs. Look, that's better than no private sector jobs, but it's not fast enough for so many Americans that are out of work. And of course, in the meantime, we're worried about a deteriorating situation in Europe. If Europe goes under, that is obviously going to have an impact on us, and it's not going to be a good one. So yeah, it's very uncertain times right now.
So the voter is sitting there trying to decide now what to do when it comes to November. And you're saying things haven't really changed. Why wouldn't the voter go for something different?
Well, I'm absolutely not saying things haven't changed. Look, the month I was sworn in January of 2009, which was the same month that the president was sworn in, that month this country lost 750,000 jobs, lost 750,000 jobs. Today, we're looking at 24 months straight of job growth in this country. So things have turned around. They just haven't turned around enough to make people happy. Look, the stock market, which, in one way or another affects a lot of people since January of 2009, is up in terms of value about $7 trillion. And by the way, if you want to think from the perspective of a voter, look at Europe right now. Europe has a far higher unemployment rate, is in a lot more trouble than we are, because they implemented the very policies that the president's opponents have been saying. Slash budgets indiscriminately, do it without regard to the economy, and guess what? That has thrown up into a recession. So the fact is that had we pursued the policies that the president's opponents are advocating for, we'd be in a lot worse shape today than we are.
So we just stay the course?
Well, no, and look, this is one of the truly frustrating things about serving in the House of Representatives, run as it is by a fairly radical group of people. Not many people disagree that we could do more. What could we do?
By the way, when you say that, you mean your opponents, the Republicans.
And I'm not just talking about the Republicans, I'm talking about the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party. Speaker John Boehner has a long career of compromising and working with people to get things done, but he's constrained by some very radical people. And, I'll give you the best example. For decades now, the parties have come together around a transportation bill to, invest in our highways, our bridges, our railways. If I were king today, I would say, let's invest some money in our infrastructure. We're going to do it anyway. We're not going to tolerate bridges falling down, as happened in Coscob many years ago. We're going to spend that money anyway. If we did it today, we'd be hiring engineers and steel workers and people who are out of work who then would spend money in their communities. But for the first time in decades, the transportation bill is being held up in the House because the Republicans won't let it move unless it has the Keystone Pipeline in it. Now, fine, let's talk about the Keystone Pipeline, but let's not hold up investment in our infrastructure that'll create jobs.
So if you were King Himes, what else would you do?
Well, I think at the top of my list would be investment in our infrastructure right here in the 4th District. You don't need to be in this area for more than 20 minutes to know how important it is that we focus on our trains, our highways, and our bridges. And yes, that involves spending, but we're going to spend that money anyway. Today we can borrow that money for 0% is what the federal government is borrowing at. And look, guys like me have been, or I in particular, have been pretty serious about understanding in the long run we've got to address the debt. But I would put infrastructure investment at the very top of our list, and then whatever else we can do to urge manufacturing back into this area. I've done some visits to some manufacturers up in the Bridgeport area, and I think there are some things we could do to help them along the way. Training people that are qualified to work in these places, this is what we should be focused on.
Well, your opponents would say, we have to cut, not spend.
Well, and they're right about that. And by the way, last August in the Budget Control Act, I voted for some very significant cuts. But you can cut too much. And I just need to point across the Atlantic Ocean to what Europe has done, which by cutting too much has devastated their economies. They're back in recession. Their unemployment rates range from 12 to 26%. So yes, we need to cut. We need to do it smart. Are you going to cut the investment we make in training our kids to be workers? Are you going to cut the investment we make in our airports and our railways and our ports that are the skeleton that allows for a healthy economy? I don't think so. So yes, we need to cut, and that's a very hard conversation to have, but we just need to do it smart.
We're going to continue the conversation. Talk a little bit more about Europe right after this break. Be right back. Overseas, this week on News 12 Connecticut and around the nation, we reported that the U.S. had suffered its 2,000th casualty since Operation Enduring Freedom. Actually, the news that first day was that it was the 2,000th in Afghanistan. Turns out it was since the effort began over there since 9/11. Stay the course or accelerate moving out?
Accelerate moving out. I visited Afghanistan, saw the stunning work our troops are doing there, and saw the impossibility of taking a country which, looks in many ways like the medieval era, or maybe even a tribal Stone Age era. And to think that we as Americans are going to go in and fundamentally change that society is a very, very misguided idea. And as you point out, the cost in terms of human life has been staggering. The cost in terms of dollars has been staggering. Tom, I was with a group of veterans 2 nights ago over here at the Norwalk VFW. It's not just the 2,000. The rate of suicides of returning veterans is now exceeding the rate of combat deaths. These are young men and women who come back badly damaged from their experiences, and we're going to be taking care of them for a very, very long time.
All right, so we get out of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, we see things ramping up in Syria. Do we step in there?
Just a moment on Afghanistan before we go to Syria. Look, the difficulties in that area are in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan. We are being pretty successful, pretty aggressive in chasing the bad guys in Pakistan, and we've got to keep doing that. Syria is a very, very different situation. Look, Syria, you can't construct a more complicated situation. You've got Iran on one side, Turkey, a NATO ally, you've got Israel, you've got tribal anger and whatnot, and you've also got a monster of a president there who is killing his own people, assisted, of course, by Russia. So what do? I'm not at a point now where I think we should get involved other than to provide whatever aid, and I would probably say non-lethal aid, to the rebellion against Assad, and to squeeze the Russians to stop arming this murderer. Now, that's going to be frustrating. It is going to take some time to dislodge this guy, but he's a monster.
How do you squeeze Russians?
Well, it's a little bit like, squeezing China, right? These are countries whose interests often are opposed to ours, but whose interests are very much aligned with ours in places like Iran. We need to work with them in making sure that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons. So you know what you do? I think you do what we're doing right now, which is you say to Russia it is unacceptable. You call them to account when they ship helicopters to the Syrian regime, and you put pressure on where you can, mindful of the fact that we need to work with them in other areas of the world.
It's like a giant game of Risk.
It's like a game of three-dimensional chess.
What about Iran? Are we doing enough in terms of their nuclear effort?
Well, we're a couple of weeks from yet another ratcheting up of the sanctions on Iran, and I think that we are doing a lot. I think we need to do more. For most of us, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is an intolerable prospect. On the other hand, of course, a military solution to that problem, again, talk about all hell breaking loose and gas prices going up and who knows what occurs there. So the answer, obviously, is let's do everything we can through sanctions, which, by the way, are biting. The Iranian economy is in a lot of trouble today, to put pressure on the regime to finally say, hey, we're going to stop this activity.
We've been reading lately of the Obama administration's role in the secret war that's going on, the cyber attacks for one, and the drones for another, the targeted people. Are you on board with that kind of effort?
It depends on what you mean by that. This administration has in some ways surprisingly turned out to be extraordinarily aggressive across the board on chasing down terrorists, the killing of Osama bin Laden, the drone strikes which have devastated Al-Qaeda, the cyber attacks, the very controversial concept of this president choosing to kill an American citizen who was a terrorist in Yemen. Very, very aggressive administration. And so what I would say to you is that some of those things on the margin are concerning. The idea that the president has a list of people targeted for assassination that doesn't have review by either the Congress or the judiciary is a profoundly uncomfortable idea that we need to really talk about as a people. On the other hand, look, I was in downtown Manhattan on 9/11, and so an aggressive lean-forward approach in going after these guys, whether it's through, getting into their computers or tracking them down with drones, is the right thing to do.
I'm going to take one last break. When we come back, let's talk about lawmakers and the public's perception of them and how that's changed in the last 3 years that you've been in office. Back in just a moment. Stay with a few minutes left with Congressman Himes. Certainly in my tenure on the news desk, I haven't seen such divisiveness in this country. And the public's perception is that Washington lawmakers, even lawmakers here in Connecticut for that matter, just can't get along anymore. What's your feeling about that? Has it gotten worse, or is it just public perception?
It's unquestionably gotten worse. This is something that's been going on for a couple of decades. But of course, with the economy crumbling, with Americans looking at the bailout, we could have a long conversation about whether the bailouts made sense or did not make sense, but never supposed to happen in a capitalist system. Banks failing, the SEC not doing its job. I mean, Americans are rightly angry at their government, at their banking sector. I get that. But yeah, the partisanship is really discouraging, and it's why it's a big system. There's a limited amount of things that a guy like me can do, but I try. To give you one example, I was one of 38 members of Congress who voted against both the Republican and the Democratic budgets 5 weeks ago, and these were largely political documents in favor of a budget, the Simpson-Bowles budget, which actually drew Democrat and Republican support. So little things like that, I hope, can maybe it's on the other side of the presidential election, because of course we're going to hear an awful lot of crazy rhetoric, but start to build trust between the parties and a sense of working together and
Is there any reason to assume that's going to happen?
Well, there's no reason to.
It's all headed in the other direction.
No, I disagree with that, Tom. Look, the bill I just referred to, which was the Simpson-Bowles budget, this wasn't to get our country in reasonable fiscal shape. It was supported by Republicans and Democrats. And yes, there was only 38 of them, of us, but you got to start somewhere. I do think that as two things happen, it's going to get better. One, we're going to get on the other side of this election, and of course the election is going to cause all sorts of, just wait till you see the TV ads. We're going to get on the other side of the election, and over time the economy is going to improve, and people's anger and emotion is going to start to drain out, and it'll create a little bit more space for Republicans and Democrats to work together on things that they've always worked together on.
Now, why do you assume the anger and emotion is going to abate after this election? It didn't the last time.
Well, that's a good question, and you're sort of pointing out my optimism. I think it's going to abate because I do think over time the economy is going to improve, and of course most people out there are angry over jobs, they're angry over the economy, and rightly so. And I do think that it's going to. I can't tell you if it's 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months from now, but it's going to improve, and people are going to feel.
Well, you've heard from me. What are your constituents telling you when you meet them out in the public?
Well, it's interesting, Tom, and this is a little bit of an illustration into part of the challenge that a guy like me has. Most of my constituents say, do what you did when you voted for the Simpson-Bowles budget. Work with the Republicans. The one bill I passed on the floor of this Congress, in a Republican Congress, it was co-authored by a Republican out of Arkansas, a freshman, by the way. Do that stuff. They really appreciate that kind of reaching across the aisle. On both fringes, though, and here's the interesting thing, on both fringes, and I'm talking about the far left and the far right, the attitude is much more uncompromising. Their attitude is fight, don't compromise, don't even talk to the other side. The good news is that's actually a very small minority of certainly my constituents.
But it seems that everybody has to play to those extremes.
Well, not everybody, and in fact, I'm very fortunate to represent a district that is pretty centrist, where we don't have a lot of extremist politics. We've got Republicans and Democrats, but you know what? They're not that far. That's not true nationally, of course, and we've seen this with Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was a pretty liberal governor of Massachusetts, and of course, running in a Republican presidential primary, he's had to say and do some things which were kind of at odds with his record. So I'm lucky in that regard, and unfortunately, I think much of the rest of the country more values people who play to their base.
Education made big thrust during the Bush administration. Is it making any advances?
I'm so glad you raised that. We spend so much time talking about jobs today and tomorrow, as we should, because we don't have enough of them. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we talk about jobs, we are talking about education. Are we training our kids to be great business people and lawyers and doctors? By the way, to work in manufacturing facilities up here in Bridgeport that are hiring, CAD/CAM designers? The answer to that question is today we're not doing a good enough job. And so the Governor Malloy's emphasis on education and reform, which of course is breaking some eggs out there right now. Arne Duncan's focus on this stuff, very, very important. And I hope in the next Congress it becomes agenda item, number 1 or 2, because jobs 5 years from now is about education today.
And the assessments that are in place, all the testing that has to be done, and getting rid of the schools that aren't making it, all of that's moving forward in the way you'd like to see it?
Well, no, it's not. It's not. I mean, you know, the indicators of how we're doing. I saw an ad on TV just last night. Math scores. The United States is number 25. You know, you cannot be number one in innovation, in starting new businesses, if you're number 25 on math and science and engineering. So no, it's not going in the right direction. But you do see inklings. You know, in Bridgeport, which has, let's face it, not good high schools. Half the kids are not graduating. You've got a lot of turmoil there, a lot of chaos, but you have things being done differently, and we need to do more of that. Testing that you asked about, testing is important. Too much testing, you know, teach our ability to teach. So testing and evaluation is important, but it's not everything.
And the tenure issue that Malloy is facing here in Connecticut?
Well, you know, I think the governor is trying to articulate a position that most people would agree with, which is whether you have tenure or not, you need a system which rewards and promotes and celebrates great teachers, because that's the number one thing that determines whether a kid gets a good education, and a system that if a teacher is failing, either gives them the tools to not fail or takes them out of the system.
Well, in your profession and mine, we have no tenure, and we have no
That's for
tenure
sure.
here. We've run out of time. I thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for joining us as well.